Ever wondered if the president has to report food, transportation, and other such gifts from taxpayers on his or her own taxes? Well, want to know more? And the short answer is no. Thank you for watching. Just joking, let's carry on. And although it's difficult to find an official explanation, or even a detailed one, after doing a deep dive into tax law, the answer appears to lie in the United States' ridiculously complicated tax code. So let's start with the gifts. The transportation, security, housing, and other benefits received by the president and his family are not gifts, but assuming they were, the president would not have to pay any tax imposed. In particular, 26 USC subsection 102A, gifts are, with some exceptions, specifically excluded from taxable income. Quote, gross income does not include the value of property acquired by gift, bequest, device, or inheritance. Rather, taxes owed for any gift are governed by U.S. estate and gift tax law, specifically 26 U.S.C. subsection 2502 section C, which imposes the burden of paying any taxes due on the person who made the gift. Quote, the tax imposed by section 2501 shall be paid by the donor. The quote ends. This gift tax will kick in once the yearly value of any gift exceeds the annual exclusion rate per person. For 2024, that's $18,000, or once the total amount of gifts given over a lifetime exceeds the lifetime exemption for both gifts and transfers on death. For 2024, that's $13,610,000. So, if the perks of Air Force One and the White House are considered gifts, even discounting hyperbolic claims to reflect reality, the US citizens would owe the IRS some dough on these gifts to the president, which, of course, is absurd. But luckily, these extras are not simply the largesse of the people, but rather are necessary for the president to do his job. As such, according to federal tax law and regulations, the gratis transportation, food, and housing received by the Commander-in-Chief are non-taxable fringe benefits. One time, the president actually had to pay for all of this type of stuff himself, including any White House expenses, which is partially how such individuals as Thomas Jefferson became so hugely in debt, along with his habit of constantly buying things for himself he couldn't afford, even when already deeply in debt. This was also a financial burden on rare, non-independently wealthy presidents before the law was changed, such as James Garfield, who had previously been a janitor, carpenter, and a school teacher, among other things. When he was president, he didn't even have enough money to own a coach and had to borrow one to get around. Just before we continue with today's episode, have you ever Googled yourself and found a treasure trove of personal information just floating around the internet? Well, good news, that's where today's sponsor, Incognito, comes in. Every year, data breaches are on the rise, and companies are collecting your information without you even knowing it. These are data brokers, and they're kind of like the internet's nosy neighbors who know everything about you, your name, your address, your social security number, and more. And they're selling that information to anyone willing to pay. But don't worry, Incogni is here to help you take back control. With just 3 easy steps, you can protect your privacy. First, create an account and let Incogni know whose data to remove. Next, give them the green light to act on your behalf, and then just relax while they handle all of those pesky data brokers. And here's the thing, Incogni doesn't just remove your data once, they keep an eye out for any new records popping up, making sure your information stays offline and safe. Plus, you can try Incogni risk-free for 30 days. If you're not fully satisfied with the service, you'll get a full refund. No strings attached. So if you're tired of feeling exposed and want to take your personal data back, check out Incogni. Use code FOUNDOUT at incogni.com/foundout for a whopping 60% off an annual plan. Huge thanks to them for sponsoring, and now back to today's episode. Alright, moving on from gifts, let's now talk about non-taxable fringe benefits. Defined by the IRS as a form of pay for the performance of services, fringe benefits are often taxable as income to the employee who receives them. However, there are certain perks that are specifically excluded from the imposition of income tax, for regular Joes and the president alike. Let's start with meals and lodging. Although we were unable to find support for this proposition, it appears that this exclusion, 26 U.S.C. section 119, would apply to keep the White House, its staff, including a private chef, and certain meals out of the first family's taxable income. It provides, in pertinent part, quote, there shall be excluded from gross income of an employee the value of any meals or lodgings furnished to him, his spouse, or any of his dependents by or on behalf of his employer for the convenience of the employer, but only if 1, his meals are furnished on the business premises of the employer, and 2, the employee is required to accept such lodging on the business premises as a condition of his employment. In the case of the president, this also applies to vacation homes and travel. As historian Richard Norton Smith said, if the president goes on vacation, it's part of the job because the president never goes on vacation. I don't think you can legitimately argue against the communications and everything else that travels with and surrounds a president. That said, the president and his family are responsible for paying for certain items, including all their own groceries, drinks, dry cleaning, and even their toothpaste. Although, as one commentator rightly put it, the private chef then prepares dinner using those groceries. Moving on from there, let's talk about transportation and security. When it comes to excluding Air Force One, the presidential limousine, and all of the security for himself and his family, Jason J. Sharma put up his theory of how the working condition fringe exclusion applies to keep income from being imputed to the president. If you start with Treasury Regulation 1.132-5, you find the rules regarding fringe benefits. President Obama would be defined as a government employee according to M7I, and as such is provided transportation for security concerns, MI. Spouses and dependents of government employees are extended this service as it is deemed a security concern exists for them too, all of which is excluded from Obama's gross income as well, M24. In fact, it appears that under even a general reading of the regulation 26 CRF section 1.132-5, the security and transportation provided would be excluded from the president's income. To wit, income does not include the value of a working condition fringe, which is any property or service provided to an employee, to the extent that if the employee paid for the property or service, the amount paid would be allowable as a deduction. This certainly appears to be the case, as each of these expenses would be incurred as a result of the president's employment. As one former White House insider noted, the presidency is a full-time job in the 24-hour sense. He must function and be able to function as president all the time. Beyond all of this, we have the presidential prerogative. You see, regardless of whether these laws and regulations or others support the president's privilege to enjoy the perks of the office, that right remains unquestioned. As former advisor to President Carter and Ford recently said, the idea of letting the president of the United States out without that degree of security is bizarre. I can't think of any perk I would consider taxable when it has to do with handling the most important, often the most secure business of the United States. Now let's move on to whether or not the president gets sick days. To begin with, the President of the United States technically never takes a day off. Even when they're ostensibly on vacation, they are still very much the leader of the country and have many duties to fulfill on a daily basis. For example, even while on vacation, they need to continue to have things like intelligence and national security briefings and other such meetings so that if an emergency does suddenly come up, they can react quickly in an informed way. Because of this, the president, in addition to never technically being able to have a full day off while on vacation, doesn't get sick days either. Of course, the president is not only human allegedly, but also, generally speaking, quite an old human, and thus they get ill, occasionally rather seriously. So what happens then? Well, that's where the 25th Amendment potentially comes into effect. In a nutshell, among other things, it provides that if the president ever gets so ill that they cannot physically perform necessary presidential duties anymore, their vice president can become the acting president on their behalf until they're able to resume their duties. So, in a way, this is a mechanism for the president to take a sick day if they want it, and whenever they want it. It's also noteworthy that even if the president does not wish to relinquish the office during a time in which they are unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the 25th Amendment provides a mechanism for the vice president to simply take the office from the president until such a time as the president is once again able to resume duties. Amusingly, it's not fully clear here what the scope of this section of the 25th Amendment is. For example, while the president is sleeping and thus in an unconscious state, they are most definitely unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office until someone wakes them up. So technically, the vice president and certain others could get together on any given night and temporarily make the vice president acting president until such a time as the president wakes up and no doubt sends off the appropriate document to declare that they are, in fact, fit for duty, with Congress no doubt concurring at that point. Or if I were president and my VP did that, I'd probably just take that rare opportunity to roll back over and go back to sleep, then maybe around noon have a leisurely breakfast before finally sending off the appropriate letter that I'm back in business if I wanted to. In the end, this latter rule allowing the vice president to forcibly take over is probably for the best, as United States presidents are generally loath to give up the office even temporarily. Despite many presidents having serious health issues and occasionally being incapacitated during their time in office, generally largely kept from the public eye at the time, only 2 have actually used this power in the over half-century that the 25th Amendment was ratified. Breaking the trend, the first president to make use of the 25th Amendment was Ronald Reagan on July 13, 1985, when he temporarily officially bestowed the powers of the office onto Vice President George Bush while Reagan underwent surgery for colon cancer. Bush reportedly spent a whole 8 hours being president before Reagan decided he'd recovered enough from his surgery to start being president again. A thing to note is that prior to handing the powers of the presidency to Bush at 11:28 a.m., Reagan spent his morning as he normally did, going about presidential duties, and subsequently spent most of the evening after he became president again at 7:22 p.m., catching up on everything he'd missed during the day. So, not really much of a sick day. The only other president to bestow the powers of the presidency onto their vice president was George W. Bush in 2002, and later in 2007, each time so that he could have a colonoscopy. On each occasion, Vice President Dick Cheney was acting president for a little over 2 hours, at which point Bush resumed his duties. Or, to put it another way, during his 8 years in office, Bush technically had 4 hours of official time off, most of which he spent with a camera up his bottom. This lack of leave taken for ill health is a surprising fact, given that, as previously alluded to, the large percentage of presidents who have suffered through various serious illnesses during their time in office. Most infamously, Woodrow Wilson had a massive stroke in 1919, resulting in the temporary loss of the use of the left side of his body, as well as him becoming blind in the left eye and with diminishing vision in his right. What his cognitive state was at this time isn't fully known, as this was all kept from the public by his wife Edith and his physician, Dr. Cary Grayson. So, how was he able to run the country in this state? Well, he wasn't really. His wife took over handling what information was passed to him and what issues she simply delegated out for other people to handle. She also barred any direct access to the president for several weeks after the stroke, with the lone exception being Dr. Grayson, who was allowed to attend to him, and was speculating nurses, though this is never mentioned anywhere we could find. As Edith herself would later write, "So began my stewardship. I studied every paper sent from the different secretaries or senators and tried to digest and present in tabloid form the things that, despite my vigilance, had to go to the president. I myself never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs. The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not, and the very important decision of when to present matters to my husband." That said, it is thought by many historians that her claim that she never made direct presidential decisions herself is stretching the truth at best, and at worst just a blatant lie. That's not to mention completely controlling the information that went to the president, and what tasks, and to whom, were delegated out. That's questionable for a person not elected to office to do, even for a day, let alone an extended period. While Wilson did recover somewhat over the next year and a half or so of his presidency, in the interim, there was much question over whether he was actually still mentally and physically fit enough to continue on as president. Despite this, and certain very pressing and far-reaching matters being decided, like whether the United States should join the League of Nations, he refused to give up his position, a key point discussed when the 25th Amendment was being drafted a few decades later. While other presidents had, before and after Wilson, suffered from various ailments, the most notable to the development of the 25th Amendment was Dwight D. Eisenhower. While in office, he suffered a severe heart attack and then a subsequent stroke. He also had to have surgery to remove about 10 inches of his small intestine as a result of complications owing to Crohn's disease. During these times, he did attempt to take sick days by having Attorney General Herbert Brownell Jr. write up a document passing off some of the powers and duties of the president to Vice President Richard Nixon. Other presidents had more or less done similar things before when necessary, but always in secret so as to not publicly reveal their medical issues. Eisenhower was essentially bucking the trend of keeping it a secret and trying to set a precedent to make the whole thing official. And indeed, from a practical standpoint, Nixon and Eisenhower's cabinet did take over his duties when he was incapacitated. It also could be interpreted that Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 of the US Constitution did allow for such when the president was unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. But the wording here is sufficiently vague to call into question whether, in these cases, the vice president is actually endowed with the powers given to the president. Because of this, despite Eisenhower giving the green light, there was uncertainty whether Nixon was actually the acting president or not at these times, which could have created major problems had certain emergencies come up. The matter finally came to a head with the president most considered the picture of robust youthful health, John F. Kennedy. It turns out Kennedy essentially needed his own pharmacy and team of doctors to keep him functioning semi-normally throughout his presidency, a fact only quite recently made public. The medical issues Kennedy suffered from were many and serious, some of which may in turn have been caused by the extensive medication that he regularly took. First up was a potentially life-threatening problem in Addison's disease, where the adrenal glands don't produce enough of certain essential hormones. Next up, he suffered from osteoporosis, resulting in 3 fractured vertebrae in his back. He also suffered from irritable bowel syndrome that saw him dealing with severe abdominal pain and occasionally dangerous bouts of diarrhea. Then there was his hypothyroidism. And just for fun, likely because of some of the medications he was on, he seemed particularly prone to infections. To treat all of this, he was variously put on thyroid hormone, Ritalin, methadone, Demerol, barbiturates such as phenobarbital, various antidiarrheal drugs, testosterone, procaine, codeine, corticosteroids, Lomotil, Metamucil, paregoric, amphetamines, memprobamate, Librium, and given penicillin and various other antibiotics whenever infections would spring up, like we said, a pharmacy. Notably, many of these medications could potentially affect mood and his decision-making ability, but without some of them, Kennedy would have been crippled by pain. Even with them, as Kennedy Kennedy's political advisor Dave Powers once noted, Kennedy always traveled with crutches. Further, when he was out of the public eye, he walked gritting his teeth, but then when he came into the room where the crowd was gathered, he was erect and smiling, looking as fit and healthy as the light heavyweight champion of the world. Then, after he finished his speech and answered questions from the floor and shook hands with everyone, we would help him back into the car and he would lean back on the seat and close his eyes in pain. Kennedy's many maladies were not, however, what helped spur the creation of the 25th Amendment, though may have been had they been widely known. Rather, it was when Kennedy was shot that everything finally came to a head, with the question being asked, what would have happened had Kennedy lived but been in a brain-dead state? As previously noted, while one could interpret Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 of the Constitution in such a way as to provide for the Vice President to take over almost immediately in such cases, the wording wasn't concrete enough on this or for many other such scenarios in which the Vice President might need to become acting president. It wasn't even clear in these cases if the Vice President did take over if the original president should get the job back if they were once again fit for office later during the allotted term. This ambiguity is a major issue. If, say, a nuclear strike were launched against the United States in the interim from when the president was no longer fit for office and when the government finally got around to deciding the vice president should indeed take over. Thus, about a year and a half after Kennedy's assassination in July of 1965, Congress sent the 25th Amendment out to the states to ratify, which it finally was on February 10, 1967, clarifying what should be done in many of these scenarios. So, to sum up, the president is not given any allotment of sick days, but the 25th Amendment does provide them a mechanism to take such if they feel they're unable to perform the duties of the office. But for reasons like that it's not politically couth for the president to show any weakness, only 2 presidents in history have ever done this since it became an option, both of whom were having something done to their colon at the time. For the rest, when they were medically incapacitated, they seemed to generally try to hide this from the public whenever possible and to delegate tasks and rearrange their work schedule as best they could to take a little time off. And when they couldn't do such, they simply muscled through the rest of their duties. Bonus fact: all federal employees, including the president, are prohibited from keeping gifts from foreign governments and officials that are worth more than $350. However, particularly with lavish ceremonial gifts given by other heads of state to the president, the gifts are typically graciously accepted, then turned over to the National Archives. For domestic gifts, the president is generally free to accept unsolicited personal gifts from the American public, from relatives, and gifts that are given on the basis of personal friendship. However, the president must publicly disclose personal financial information, including personal gifts over minimal amounts, $350 as of 2012.